In summary, the Revelation clearly evidences thematic parallels, similar content, overlaid structure with the synoptic eschatological discourses. The first 5 seals patently follow the birth pangs of the synoptics. These judgments follow the sequential order of all 3 synoptic gospels. And the 6th seal has been shown to correlate with eschatological passages of Luke to evidence the establishment of a midpoint of Daniel's 70th week. Conclusion: the cumulative testimony of thematic and linguistic affinities strongly suggests that the Revelation contains synoptic or gospel motifs in the development of the later chapters. The Revelation amplifies, expands on the synoptic discourses by means of apocalyptic imagery. Now, let's examine this in light of the pre-wrath rapture theory. How am I doing time-wise? Am I doing fine? Okay. I didn't have my watch with me. I want to make sure I'm... All right. We're just going to keep going because we need to be practical about this. So, I'm suggesting the book of Revelation, the 6th seal is the midpoint. From the 7th seal, which is the 7 trumpets, which is the 7 bowls, that is all the Great Tribulation. The 6th seal says it's the Great Tribulation, the great wrath of God. I'm suggesting the first 3.5 years are the first 5 seals leading up to it because they parallel the Gospels beginning of birth pangs. Now, an examination of the pre-wrath rapture theory. The pre-wrath rapture theory says that the 4th seal, somewhere between the 4th seal and the 5th seal, is the midpoint. That the first 5 seals are man's wrath, not God's wrath. That God's wrath doesn't begin until deep, maybe 2/3 of the way into the tribulation period. So let's say 6 years, 5.5 years, that the Great Tribulation begins. But they have to move the 6th seal deep into the second half because they know very clearly it says the wrath of God is coming. One of the things that Marvin Rosenthal and the late Robert Van Kampen did was to distort some of the plain and simple grammar of the Greek text. First question, does Revelation 4:1 through 6:11 contain God's judgment and wrath? Rosenthal says no, it is the wrath of man. I say this is an artificial hermeneutical principle. The example, when you get to Revelation chapter 17, it says, "And the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire." Why? For God has put it in their hearts to execute His purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God should be fulfilled. To try to say that, oh, if it doesn't say that it's the wrath or the judgment of God, it must be the wrath of man, is a false principle. Here in chapter 17, we have God fulfilling His judgment, His purpose, His wrath through these nations, the 10-nation confederacy. A second argument, Jesus breaks the seals. Jesus Christ is the one who breaks the seals and initiates the judgment. He begins the process of establishing His rule on earth, Revelation chapter 5. John 5:22, 23, and 27 states, "For not even the Father judges anyone, but He has given all judgment to the Son, in order that all may honor the Son, even as they honor the Father. And He gave Him authority to execute judgment because He is the Son of Man." It's a false dichotomy to say that God is not executing these judgments when Jesus is the one breaking the seal. The cosmic phenomenon. Revelation 4 and 5 contain the judgment of God. Each of the septet judgments, the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, as well as other plagues, are preceded by the execution of cosmic phenomenon, such as lightning and thunder and earthquakes, which come forth from the throne of God. It happens in chapter 4. This cosmic phenomenon is the signal that the coming of God's judgment is coming upon the world. When you look at parallel passages of judgment, Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 21, lists sword, famine, wild beasts, and plague as judgments from God. That's exactly what we have going on in the first 5 seals. So my answer is, look, you cannot create a false structure to the book of Revelation. The 6th seal is clearly the wrath of God, is the midpoint of the tribulation. I remember, it had to be 15 or more years ago, when Robert Van Campen called me in my office. I was teaching at the time at William Tyndale College, and he wanted to talk about the pre-wrath rapture theory. It was in its infancy. It hadn't been published or anything. And he was talking to me, and he was explaining to me his view of pre-wrath. And, when he finished talking to me about it, I said, pre-wrath is a great way of describing pre-tribulationalism or pre-70th week. And it got very quiet on the other end of the line. At that point, I didn't know that his pre-wrath chronology was going to be late into the second half. Because we hadn't talked about chronology. He talked about all these things. God must remove the church before his wrath comes. And I'm saying, you're right. Yeah, I said, that's a great way of describing the pre-tribulational, pre-70th week rapture of the church. And it was just silent. Pre-wrath is pre-70th week, because the first 5 seals contain the tribulation of God. Now, if you want more detail on this, back in 1990 for Dallas Seminary's BibSac, I wrote a more extensive article where I did 13 or 14 criticisms of the pre-wrath rapture. Now, how about mid-tribulationalism with Gleason Archer? Gleason Archer states the first half is the wrath of man, the second half is the wrath of God. Again, a false dichotomy. He says, John does not follow a neatly segmented chronological sequence in the series. See, if you're mid-trib or post-trib, you got to shuffle the chapters. J. Oliver Buswell identifies a mid-70th week rapture with the 7th trumpet. But the 7th trumpet is very deep into the last few months, I would say, of the tribulation. A far more likely point of identification of the rapture, he says, is found in Revelation 14:14. Now, what are the problems with this? Revelation 14:14 says, Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. Then he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Gleason Archer takes this passage as the reference to the rapture of the church. Now, part of the problem for this is confusion. First of all, confusion about the people. Revelation 14:6 says, And I saw another angel flying in the mid-heaven, having an eternal gospel to preach to those who live on the earth, and to every nation and tribe and tongue and people. This group is described as those who live on the earth. This phrase, I would say, is a technical phrase, better understood as referring to unbelievers. The phrase is used in Revelation 3:10 and 11:10 to refer to unbelievers, non-believers. These aren't believers who are being reaped. These are non-believers who are being judged in Revelation chapter 14. Revelation chapter 14 and 14 through 16 relate more to judgment than deliverance. The phrase, the harvest of the earth, is used by Jeremiah to refer to the final judgment of Babylon, and by Matthew to refer to the final judgment of the world at the second coming of Jesus Christ. A proper understanding of Revelation 14 sees the chapter as a prelude to the final execution of the 7 bowls and judgments which finished the wrath of God on Babylon and on